G'day and welcome to this week's episode of The Other Side Interviews. I'm Damian and this is our weekly interview show which streams every Tuesday night on ADH-TV at around 6 p.m, then up on demand for you afterwards. We're also on most podcast platforms at The Other Side Australia. And remember, our main show first runs every Friday night at 8 p.m. here on ADH-TV, The Other Side Australia. Then, of course, on demand for you as ever. And The Other Side Australia is your weekly summary shortcut to the news and commentary of the week. Tuesday night, though, our interview show, and my guest tonight is a prominent centre-right thinker and writer, and he's also a prominent member of Australia's Jewish community, Dr. David Adler. Dr. Adler is president of the Australian Jewish Association. He's a medical graduate of the University of New South Wales, a former Deputy Medical Secretary of the Australian Medical Association, and David writes frequently on political issues for The Spectator. He's prolific on Twitter and is no stranger to viewers of ADH TV. Now, we don't do identity politics on this show, but if Indigenous affairs and LGBTQI plus issues are any indication, then according to the modern intellectual left cool kids, everyone who shares a race, a gender, a religion or a sexuality must always think the same politically. But there are in fact conservatives everywhere. David, thank you very much for joining us. Just explain to me, first of all, you set up the AJA in 2017. Was this in some kind of response to a sort of left-wing shift happening in the other major Jewish organisations in Australia?
Thank you, Damian, and great to join you. It was set up by me with a team of people in Melbourne and Sydney, because most of the Jewish community is based in Melbourne and Sydney. And you're right, it was in response to the leftward shift. The Jewish organisations have not been immune to, I guess, what's popularly known as the long march of the left through the institutions, getting involved in all sorts of woke causes. But also, parallel with that, we saw a number of Jewish organisations move away from what we regard as genuine Jewish values. Whether you're observant or not is a different issue, but at least respect the traditional values. And what's interesting, Damian, and what might be, I think, a model of hope for people who are centre-right, conservative or libertarian, is that when people are on their computers or their phones, they select what sort of information, what sort of organisations they want to link up with. And quite rapidly, AJA has grown to be the largest Jewish organisation in Australia, as measured by social media following and as measured by community engagement. If you like, people are voting with their clicks. And I think we have a useful model by being principled, not bowing to PC or the woke causes of the day. And that's what AJA is all about. And
so now you've become very nearly the top Jewish association in Australia, I think.
Well, certainly as measured by exposure on social media and to some extent in the general media as well. Certainly in terms of following and the amount of people in the community that interact with us, we claim the top spot.
Now, look, I do want to cover a lot of issues today. I want to talk about Moira Deeming's troubles with the Liberal Party in Victoria and your thoughts about all of that because of the neo-Nazi crowd that turned out, or few people really that turned out there, but we'll get into that later. I want to start with your interview in The Spectator a couple of weeks ago, in which you called on Australia's Jewish people to vote no in the Voice referendum. You argued in your article that the Voice proposal is contrary to Jewish values, contrary to important lessons from Jewish history, and presents potential serious specific adverse policy risks for our community. How so, David?
Well, and they're really the three main issues that you've nailed. Whether one is religious or not, whether you follow any faith or not, sometimes you can look at our long-standing Judeo-Christian ethics and foundations of Western civilization, and you'll see good wisdom for society. One of the principles is that from a religious point of view, all people are made in the image of God. What does that mean? It means that we should treat all people equally. It means all people should be regarded as equal value in a society. Now, the Voice proposal as it stands conflates a number of issues. It conflates recognition of Aboriginals as being the first people in Australia, and that you can't argue that they were the first people in Australia. It's a matter of fact. But it has built into it a special political leverage, special political access to Parliament and to advise the executive government based on race. And no other racial group or ethnic group in Australia would have that particular mechanism, that particular leverage. So from the principle that all people are equal, which is a foundation of Judaism and I believe also a foundation of Christianity, the Voice is inconsistent. So that's the first issue you mentioned.
Yep.
The second one was the historical lesson.
Yes.
And one thing that the Jewish community can add to the debate is that perhaps more so than any other people, over thousands of years, Jewish communities have lived through societies that have had divisions by race or ethnicity, political divisions from the ancient societies of the Roman Empire, which conquered the Middle East, through to the modern incarnations like the Soviet Union or, of course, the Nazism in the Second World War. People were divided by religion or race or ethnicity. There is not one single historical example where that sort of division has been good for society. Indeed, it always creates resentment at a minimum between the groups, and at worst, it creates major conflict. And then there's the third issue, which is, I guess, specific to the Jewish community or anyone who values Israel as the sole democracy in the Middle East. We've unfortunately seen some of the inner city Aboriginal activists who are quite extreme politically, and hand in hand with that seems to be a hostile attitude to Israel. So in what they called Invasion Day protests on 26 January this year, we have photographs from a couple of those protests where you won't see an Australian flag, you will see an Aboriginal flag, and you'll also see a Palestinian flag. What the hell has Palestine got to do with the 26th of January? Absolutely nothing, except it's being hijacked for political purposes.
Well, it's just the fuzzy thinking of the left conflating all these sorts of trendy issues of the moment. Why do you think, I mean, we saw in the UK when Jeremy Corbyn was the head of the Labor Party, there was a big scandal about the Labor Party and the anti-Semitism among the left and Labor in the UK. There's some creepy anti-Semitism, of course, in the far right as well. I mean, we see the neo-Nazi movement. But what is the essence of that sort of point of view? Why is the left so enamoured with the Palestinian cause at the moment rather than the Israeli cause?
There was a great leader in the UK who for a while was the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth called Jonathan Sacks. And he described anti-Semitism in a model that everyone will now understand, which is it's like a virus that morphs. It went through a period where the Jewish religion was hated, say during the Inquisition, and Jews were tortured and forced to convert. In the USSR, there was hatred of Jewish culture, and it was suppressed. It was illegal to learn Torah or to have circumcisions. In Nazism, of course, there was hatred of the Jewish race, and the Nazis took a racial approach to trying to eliminate the Jews. And in modern times, it's hatred of the Jewish state. The Jewish community and Israel are very closely identified. So by all means, Israel is not immune from criticism, and you can criticise Israel in the same way as you would criticise any other country.
Sure.
But
and the politics in Israel is divided between the more aggressive or assertive stance of the conservatives of the Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party versus, I guess, the other parties that are more left-wing.
Yeah. So the left, and we see this in the left wing of the Labor Party in Australia and in the Greens, they seem to have a particular visceral hatred of the state of Israel, more so than any other country on earth. So they'll ignore human rights abuses around in Israel's neighbours, where LGBTQ, whatever letters you like to add, people, will be thrown off buildings or killed. That can be ignored, but the slightest problem in Israel, they'll jump on with a ton of bricks.
Is this because, Israel is a successful state, and it's the traditional role of the left to always side with the underdog? So they look at the Palestinians, they see the Palestinians as poor, as being occupied.
I think it's something deeper than that, Damian, because otherwise you'd have them being more active in, say, calling out all the other persecutions that are around the world, of which there are about 25 at the moment, the largest perhaps being the Uyghurs in China. I think what's going on there is that if you want to undermine Western civilization, Western civilization is founded on Judeo-Christian ethics. Where is the place that the Judeo-Christian ethics began? It's the land of Israel. So knowingly or unknowingly, Israel is where the foundations of Western civilization occurred first, where humanity started to follow a moral code, initially the Ten Commandments, and then it expanded. And if you want to come up with some other worldview, socialism or communism or whatever cult is common now, undermining the family, undermining gender, the country,
undermining humanity, as we see with the climate cult and the environmental cult. Yeah.
The country that most identifies with those values, or at least where it began, for both Judaism and Christianity, and I say whether you're observant or not, it's a different issue, but this is where our culture began, and so they're undermining Israel.
Just to explain to non-Jewish viewers, I suppose and I only learned this myself recently, but the Torah is the first 5 books, or what the Christians would call the 5 books of Moses, right? So that's okay.
But what's this got to do with The Voice? It's got a lot to do with it, because apart from what the example I gave about so-called Invasion Day, you might recall that last year at the Sydney Festival, there was an organised boycott. So this is not just theory. We've seen it play out in Australia, because one of the acts for the Sydney Festival last year attracted some small sponsorship from Israel, happened to be a left-wing guy, a dance choreographer who was booked for the festival. And the Aboriginal activists, the sort we were talking about, joined the boycott. They pressured the Aboriginal artists to boycott. Most of them did. Most of them succumbed to the pressure. I had a conversation subsequently with someone who we regard as a moderate Aboriginal leader, Warren Mundine, and he told me that the moderates in the Aboriginal community were surprised that it had infiltrated to this extent. So it's not theory, it's happened. And so our concern is that with no restrictions on what The Voice can advise the government about, there is a considerable risk that in the near future, if the Voice was successful, and hopefully it won't be, they could advise the government to take steps that are anti-Israel, whatever, recognising a non-existent state of Palestine, ignoring the terrorism, whatever they like, and the government would have to seriously consider that advice. The leverage of the Voice can be used for anything, and that is the third risk, and that's the specific risk that applies to the Jewish community, because demonisation of Israel is linked to anti-Semitism. It's because the identity is the same.
Right. So the Voice proponents keep saying that they will not extend, scrutiny or control or advice over laws that don't affect only Aboriginal people, that they only want to be associated with laws that affect Aboriginal people. But that's not the framing as far as you know it, or as far as we can see?
It's not. It could, in fact, they can advise on anything as the wording exists at the moment. They can advise on foreign policy, they can advise on defence, they can advise on taxation, they can advise on superannuation. There have been some wild proposals floating around the internet. I'm not giving credence to the legitimacy of them, but theoretically, they could advise that a different tax rate should apply to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia, for example.
Right.
Well,
you certainly advise on some sort of reparations, as we're seeing happening in the United States and things like that.
Sure, it could. So it's open-ended. I heard a Melbourne politician, you might be familiar with David Limbrick from the Liberal Democrat Party. He asked a really interesting question on this. He said that the argument for the Voice and the argument for putting it in the Constitution are separate arguments. Again, that's another thing that's been conflated. If the government wanted to establish an Aboriginal advisory body, they could do it tomorrow.
Yes.
So he asks, why put it in the Constitution? And the answer that he hypothesises, and I agree with it, is that if something goes wrong, it is almost impossible to remove it. The only reason to put it in the Constitution is for permanency. So I think that should worry all Australians, because we saw ATSIC, a previous Aboriginal advisory body, become completely corrupted, and the government had the option to dissolve it, which happened. If the Voice became completely corrupted, what do we do? If it starts to get involved in all sorts of issues, and the one that we're specifically concerned about is the foreign policy and anti-Israel moves, but we speak on issues related to the Jewish community. Somebody who's interested in energy policy or taxation or superannuation can make the arguments about those issues. What do you do if it becomes corrupt and destructive and it's in the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, it also seems to me that it's the Voice is a body that's going to represent, as I said, I mean, not everybody of a race has the same political perspective. And I don't think you're going to see diversity within the Voice community or the Voice itself, a political diversity. It will always lean green left, probably.
Damian, let me give you one more anecdote. I have a friend of mine who's a Syrian refugee. Nice guy, well qualified, professional engineer, working in Australia, Christian, and he left that part of the world because there are parts of the Middle East where Christians are persecuted. He went from Syria to Iraq, now Australia. He thought he was coming to a country where all people are equal. He left a country where not all people are equal.
Yeah.
Now,
sad.
he's now worried. What's happening to Australia's democracy?
Yep.
Is he not as equal? He's gained his citizenship. Is he not as equal as everyone else under the Australian Constitution? Well, today, we can say, yes, you are equal. If you're an Australian citizen, you've got equality. But if we start creating a racial division, then we're preferencing one group in terms of political influence over the rest. And from his experience of having come through the refugee process from an area where there is a distinction between one type of person and another based on religion or race, he's shaking his head and saying, how on earth can Australia even contemplate this?
Now, let me throw something at you from the sort of, the conspiracy theory, right-wing conspiracy theory bucket, because we get a lot of that. I get a few emails and notes and things. One theory suggesting that the Jewish community has an interest in The Voice succeeding because it cements a fundamental Indigenous right to land in international law, or it would be another step in international law. Is that just a crazy idea, or do you see any sort of, among perhaps the Jewish left, do you see any sort of credence in that philosophy, or is there any desire to use The Voice for those ends, to promote the cause of Israel?
Absolutely not. I've not seen any of that. Zero.
Okay, so that's just silly.
The legitimacy of Israel is based on ancient and modern tools. Obviously the biblical side of it. We know that the children of Israel, after the Exodus, were led by Moses and then Joshua into the land of Israel. We know where the 12 tribes settled. We know King David and King Solomon having the kingdoms of Israel there. There's enormous archaeological support, hard evidence there. In modern times, under modern international law, what we rely on is that the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, and there were a number of legitimate legal processes which divided up the Ottoman Empire that led to the establishment of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel. And as far as Israel is concerned, there was the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Conference, the UN resolutions. There is a whole body of international precedent and law upon which Israel relies. What happens in Australia is, the footnote of a footnote. It would not have any influence on Middle East politics at all.
Okay, so it's a conspiracy theory, and a silly one.
It's nothing. I think that, but it does raise the broader question, Damian, of why are there some prominent people in the Jewish community who are supporting The Voice? I mean, we're the largest organisation saying no, but I've got to acknowledge that there are some saying yes. And I'm speculating there are two major categories of reasons. So if the people who have given you that particular theory want to look at something more substantial, here are two. Firstly, as we discussed, there has been a long march of the left through the institutions, including some of the Jewish institutions. They've got involved in climate change and gender and everything you can imagine. And along comes another one called The Voice, another woke issue, so they jump on that as well. But to be harsher, there is the possibility that some individuals are riding the political tide for the motive of follow the money. Those that are involved in some community organisations want to endear themselves to the Labor Party because they want to get government grants. And there are those who might be involved in major corporations or law or business, and they are attracted to competing for government contracts. They want the government work. So there may well be some conflicts of interest that are driving people. It is hypothesis. So I think those two categories of motive are more likely than suggesting that it's going to have an influence on international law.
Right, or any question of the ethics of or entitlement to a homeland, in a sense.
Yeah. And it's been well established and tested, and Israel's accepted as a member of the United Nations, although that body causes a lot of grief, and has trade agreements with numerous countries and diplomatic relations with the bulk of countries on the planet. It's not an issue.
No. All right. Look, this is the other side. We've got a little bit of time to chat, and I wouldn't mind, just as as a non-Jewish Australian, understanding a little bit more about Israel and Palestine. It's a conflict that never seems to end. Will we ever see it? And we're seeing the latest iterations of it now with some pretty sad stuff going on. But what is the main argument against the Palestinian position that that this is our land as they see it, and that Israel has occupied Palestine? I mean, what is the main position against that?
Let's be clear. There has never, ever been a country or state called Palestine. There has been an area. When the Romans conquered the area, in order to rub salt into the wound, they renamed Judea, as it was then known, as Palestina, which was a play on the old biblical enemy of the Philistines.
Right.
And that carried forward when, after World War I, when the Ottomans were defeated, the British had a mandate of Palestine. In other words, a mandate to manage the area. It was not a country or a state. There were no Palestinian people at that time. There were Arabs and Jews. Indeed, if you called an Arab a Palestinian in that era, it would have been regarded as an insult, because the Jews were regarded as the Palestinians. It was only in 1964, on the advice of the KGB, that Yasser Arafat claimed that there was a Palestinian people. So there is no claim, there is no history. You will find zero examples in a region which has been subject to turmoil for thousands of years. There is not a single battle of Palestinians versus anyone, because it didn't happen. It didn't exist. So under international law, the mandate of Palestine was established to create a homeland for the Jewish people. Most of it was given over to Jordan, which was supposed to be the Arab Palestine, and west of the river was supposed to be the Jewish Palestine called Israel. It does have a very long and complicated history.
Yes, but you've got the Six-Day War and then everything after that. But
it's great fun to for those interested to delve into it and debate it. But for the average person, they probably go cross-eyed listening to it.
Yeah, well, and it's been many, many, many decades, and I guess all people really want to see is peace and an end to killing, and we're seeing some quite aggressive actions. I mean, Israel's taken very assertive action, and there's grounds for that.
You're dealing with terrorism on a level that Australia can't imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the Lint Cafe in Sydney, where a single Islamic terrorist held siege for a while, and 2 people died, and everybody thinks that was a terrible event of Islamic terrorism in Sydney, and it was. But in Israel, there are hundreds per year.
Right.
And the Islamic Jihad organisations, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they have been indoctrinating their children with hatred, with anti-Semitism, with violence. If you want to go to paradise, you kill Jews and that'll give you a direct route. It has been two generations of young people completely indoctrinated into this. And Damien, I'm not optimistic about peace with the Arab Palestinians anytime soon, because if there was a change of heart, it would take two generations to wash through. But that doesn't mean that important progress can't be made. And we saw under the Trump administration, the Abraham Accords, when 4 Arab Muslim countries entered into normalisation, if you like, peace deals with Israel. Huge step forward, the biggest in a generation. And I think it is a disgrace that the people involved in that did not get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, they're not woke, David. You can't get the Nobel Peace Prize unless you're woke.
Yeah,
you actually do something productive, you're not going to get it. I want to just talk about that. I mean, do you feel optimistic at least about the Arab world more broadly being less hostile towards Israel and the usual propaganda in the Arab world receding a little bit, perhaps not in Iran, but in other countries?
I think that I'll give you. Sometimes anecdotes tell a story, and I'll tell you a little one.
We love a story. We love an anecdote.
A few months ago, when I went to Canberra, as I sometimes do as part of our work, I got in touch with the UAE embassy and said that I'm coming. Can we have a meeting? The UAE,
of which Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Yep. And
the UAE was the first country to enter into the Abraham Accords. And the UAE ambassador invited me and a small delegation from AJA to his official residence for lunch. And we were treated with great hospitality. We had a very positive discussion. So making that progress in the Middle East on the world stage has spin-offs that people don't even think about. That, a couple of years later in Australia, there is contact between the Jewish community and an Arab country on a level that would have been inconceivable a few years prior.
Yeah.
So, I think that those who want to establish normal, peaceful relationships, there is cause for optimism. The fundamentalists, those that are driven by, the harsher end of Islam, who want to establish a caliphate or believe that Jews are the most evil of creatures created by Allah on earth. We have some problems, but that's why Israel has to be strong. Middle East is not like sitting in Australia where compromise and negotiation and it is how you solve problems. What is respected in the Middle East is actually strength, and strength brings peace. So there hasn't been an open war between Israel and another country for years, since the mid-70s. That's huge. Yes, there are lots of little terrorism problems and sometimes big terrorism problems to deal with, but there is not a single Arab army at this stage which would attack Israel, or vice versa. Now, Iran threatening nuclear obliteration is a different category. The role of America is really important. We are worried that the Biden administration has been weak with the Middle East policy, and that we're seeing the terrorists emboldened at the moment, and that's probably why you've seen an uptick in terrorism in the last 18 months.
All right. Well, thank you for discussing that, and we'll come back to Australia now. And any complaints or questions or comments on that you'd like to send in, please send them to send them to David and the Australian Jewish Association rather than the other side. It's always a hot topic, and we get a heck of a lot of mail when we cover it. But David, just coming back home, why do you? I want to get onto the Moira Deeming thing. So just to explain for people what went on there, Moira Deeming was elected as a Liberal Party member to the upper house, the Senate-like chamber in the State Parliament of Victoria, the Legislative Council. We don't have one of those in Queensland. New South Wales has one. The upper house of Parliament. She was a brand new freshman parliamentarian, and she decided to attend a rally, a Let Women Speak rally, which is the women who are countering the trans ideology, the gender ideology, and a bunch of neo-Nazis turned up.
Correct.
And started doing Hitler salutes and neo-Nazi horrible things. And then she was subsequently chastised by the party and then ejected from the party and all sorts of things as a result of that. Now, let's deal with the neo-Nazis first. Assuming these were genuine neo-Nazis, and I think we can establish that they were, right? Do we know that, who they were, these people? We don't.
I don't know. At least one of them was. One of them was recognised.
Was recognised. Okay.
I've seen comments that it was a setup
a setup or a false flag.
I don't know.
Right. Okay. All right. So we've got these, but neo-Nazism in general, and I'm thinking back to the movie Romper Stomper. Was Romper Stomper set in Melbourne? It was, wasn't it? Not Sydney. I can't remember. But anyway, tell us a little bit about the neo-Nazi movement in Australia. What is it, and why the anti-Semitism? Why do these radical far-right groups have this kind of anti-Semitic mentality?
I think that
in Australia, I mean,
they've swallowed some of the conspiracy theories. Now, and maybe they're ignorant of history as well. In Australia, the Jewish community began with the First Fleet. So there were about somewhere between 13 and 16 Jewish people on the First Fleet. I hasten to add they were not crew. They came as convicts along with others.
Like my Irish ancestors,
And Jewish people have played a positive role in the development of Australia, have made major contributions in the professions, law, medicine, business, arts. I mean, you can look almost anywhere. Now, there are bad apples in every barrel, and I know of some prominent Jewish people internationally who are highly controversial, and some that we would disagree with vehemently, and perhaps pretty close to the top of the list would be someone like George Soros. Highly disliked amongst the bulk of the Jewish community. But if someone believes that sort of behaviour is typical of what the Jewish community is on about, they're wrong, but they will form an adverse opinion. They will think that...
well, what is George, just fill us in, what is George Soros up to? I know his name comes up in the conservative conspiracies and right-wing... It's not a conspiracy to a large extent.
He's a multi-billionaire who made a lot of money on currency trading, and he's one of the largest funders of radical left organisations, whether it's BLM in the US, whether it's some of the climate change advocating organisations, and I would hasten to add also some anti-Israel organisations. He's got a couple of foundations set up that does this.
And this is real, right, David? This is not a conspiracy.
Yeah, no,
this is factual.
He puts a lot of money into these.
He's open about it.
He's been involved. He's been one of the speakers at the World Economic Forum. And because incidentally he happens to be Jewish, people then say, oh, this is a Jewish agenda. It is not, never has been. The Jewish agenda is to be good citizens. There is a principle which in Hebrew is Dina Hamalchut Dina, which means the law of the land is the law. So if we're living in Australia, the requirement is to respect Australian law, and we do. Now, in my own case personally, I've been a doctor in the past. I was second in charge of the Australian Medical Association. I've had a hand in some health policy. I should say, back when the AMA was a good organisation, not like it is now.
What's happened to the AMA? Just a quick sideline. It's become rather left-wing, right?
It is a classic example of the leftist activists taking over. And when I was involved, the AMA had about 70% of doctors in its membership, and now it's dropped to about 25%. So
it doesn't really represent.
A really important message is that it no longer speaks for the majority of doctors in Australia.
Right. It's a bit like the Australian Journalists Association, the other AJA, which disappeared and was swallowed up and has now become a very left-wing part of the MEAA.
I've called out the AMA on a whole range of COVID issues where they've gone overboard, and they've got involved also in climate change and refugee policy and all sorts of things that they shouldn't have.
Well, we've seen the MEAA has not stood up for free speech. They've become completely leftist. They let the police walk over journalists in Melbourne during COVID. But we digress. Sorry. Well, coming back to George, I want to just finish off on George Soros if we can, because I'm still bemused by him. So his background though was, didn't his family flee the tyranny of totalitarian communism?
He was in Nazi Germany for a while.
Okay.
And there is a story.
Hungarian, is he?
And I think so.
Yeah.
There is a story that he got by helping the Nazis confiscate Jewish property. He would identify people in the community who had done well and worked with them in that respect. His defence is that he was a teenager at the time, and that's what he needed to do to survive.
So again, that's not a conspiracy theory. That actually did happen. He's admitted that, has he?
I believe so. He's a highly controversial character, but the point
he's just a rich guy funding a lot of left-wing causes like we have here. And a nuisance.
So the issue is that the neo-Nazis will jump on somebody like him and say, "Oh, look, this is a Jewish agenda," and it's not.
No, it's George Soros'
Absolutely not. We spend time fighting the organisations and causes that he's put money into.
Yeah. Well, again, no race or religion or sexuality has one dimension politically. I mean, we all have a range of political people and political views, as you know. All right, so Moira Deeming, the neo-Nazis, they came to the thing. She gets slammed because of association with neo-Nazis. You took an interesting stance on this and decided to speak out on it, David. Why?
Yeah. Because, I mean, obviously we condemn Nazism in any of its form.
Yes.
Old or new. But it gets misused, and it gets used as a domestic political weapon. In fact, if you go back to the last Victorian state election, Dan Andrews said that his opponents were preferencing Nazis. And the journalists gave him such a soft run, said, "Okay, who are these Nazis? What's your evidence?" And he wouldn't answer. So it's been used repeatedly. I know one of the organisers of the Let Women Speak rallies. I know what their messages are. If you listened to what Moira Deeming and the others said, they were talking about defending the integrity of women's sport, so that their argument is that only biological women should play women's sport. And they also want to feel safe in places that women might be vulnerable, like change rooms and toilets and even prisons. And they're arguing that men who think that they're women should not be participating in those things or into those spaces. So they have a rally. they have a prominent British speaker come out. Her nickname is Posy Parker. I've forgotten what her real name is. It's got hyphens
I can't
all
remember
over
either,
it.
but yes, we know.
And along comes 15 to 20 guys, clearly coordinated, dressed in black shorts, black T-shirts, most of them wearing black hats and most of them wearing masks. And what was really peculiar initially was that the trans counter-protest was held back by the police, but these neo-Nazis were waved through. And there are videos of that. And we said, this is very odd policing, what's going on? They're doing their Heil Hitler salutes, which they repeat on the steps of the Victorian Parliament. After the rally was over, I get a phone call from one of the organisers, absolutely distressed that their rally had been crashed. And the politicians and mainstream media immediately say that these women are Nazis or associated with Nazis or have Nazi sympathies. That doesn't reconcile at all with their messages. It's complete bunkum. And so we were saying, we stood up for the women and we said, as a Jewish organisation, we're best placed to deal with the issue, that whatever you think of the argument that the women are making, whether you agree or disagree with those arguments, they have zero relationship with Nazism. Yes. And we object to Nazism or the Holocaust being used for domestic political purposes.
Good.
And we saw Dan Andrews do that. And to their shame, weakness and disgrace, we saw the Liberal leadership jump on it as well. And very quickly, the Victorian Liberal leader, John Pursuto, said that he couldn't be associated with someone who had I've forgotten the words he used, but was in turn associated with neo-Nazis.
Oh, it's just complete political bunkum. It was.
It is. If you use that standard that was used in that Melbourne meeting, then no politician, no public figure can turn up to a public meeting because some obnoxious characters might turn up and all of a sudden you're associated with those obnoxious characters.
But the irony is we have a woman being shut down from putting her position to protect women's rights. It's the modern left. It's the absurdity of the modern left, the ironies and the paradoxes and the perversion of the thinking of the modern left, of distorting traditional civil rights. And
now, Damian, I'll tell you one thing further. I have it's possible that there'll be legal action involving Moira Deeming and John Pursuto. I have publicly communicated to Moira Deeming that in the event that there is legal proceedings, I am prepared to be a witness on the neo-Nazi smear issue.
Good.
Because, it's nonsense. The messages that were being delivered at the rally that the women were trying to articulate have nothing to do with Nazism. And their meeting got crashed. Okay, anybody's meeting can be crashed.
One thing that concerns me, David, more broadly, is the use by the left of this domestic terrorism, domestic neo-Nazis. We have to, you would know better than anybody how bad and risky the problem is. Do we have a far-right neo-Nazi nutter problem in Australia as far as you see it?
We do, but it's relatively small. I've had the benefit of briefings from police and ASIO. It has been growing. There's a lot of it online. In reality, there's a group in South Australia. There's a group in Victoria. There are a few isolated individuals. They tend to make graffiti on buildings or put up posters and stickers. The number one terrorism threat in this country remains Salafi Islam. That has been identified in a number of the recent annual reports of ASIO. So from a Jewish perspective...
So what is that? Just define that for us, David.
It's a radical stream of Islam. I mean, we have seen people in the western suburbs of Sydney where there are Islamic gangs having a go at each other, shooting each other. Is that terrorism? Well, sort of. And our authorities have been very good at intervening in planned terrorism before it occurs. Of the people locked up in Goulburn Supermax, which is where the terrorists end up, about 95% of them are motivated by Islam. Right. So that has traditionally been the top
the dominant problem, not the radical extremist Islam.
Yeah, for physical terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean we should be complacent at all about the neo-Nazi type. And of course, it's easier politically to deal with that. So we see the state governments wanting to ban the swastika and the Nazi salute and these sort of things. Okay. But education is really important.
Yeah.
And I don't think they've done enough.
Well, that would be dealing with the real problem as opposed to dealing with the virtue signaling symbolism side, which wins them more, votes from the touchy-feely side of the left.
Damian, you know the saying, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're bound to repeat them.
Yeah. Yep.
So we need to teach history properly because it does contain important lessons so that some of the problems aren't repeated. So we need to take action against the neo-Nazis. Obviously, I don't know any credible person who supports neo-Nazism, but there are a number of potential sources of anti-Semitism. You mentioned the political left. We've discussed that. There's Islam. And I'm going to give you one that no other group will call out as well.
Well, we love an exclusive, so yeah, go ahead.
There is within the Jewish community some extremists, if you like, Jewish anti-Semites. Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you can't hate other Jews, and we do see it. It is unfortunate. Some of the most unhinged critics of Israel, and I'm not talking about ordinary political criticism, but just unhinged criticism, comes from within our own community. We also see criticisms of the practice of Judaism, etc. Right. So that's something we have to deal with.
Yes.
But if you want political correctness, you're talking to the wrong person, Damian.
No, that's fine. It's good to know the truth and reality. We don't get enough of it these days. Speaking of which, the ABC and its coverage, we have discussed this privately before. Tell me a little bit about how you perceive the way that the ABC covers the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular.
Highly, highly biased. Indeed, our organisation in the last few weeks, we don't respond to many of the items on the ABC because there are just too many examples. But we took issue with two of them recently where they don't identify the people involved as terrorists, even though they might be members of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade or Hamas. And so they'll report the IDF killed 3 Palestinians. That will be the ABC report. And anyone who doesn't have any more information will think, oh, well, there we go. Israel's gone and shot a few Palestinians for some reason. They leave out that this was a targeted anti-terror operation in an area which has generated over 50 terrorist attacks this year. So we've had two stories from the ABC corrected by the complaints mechanisms, the ombudsman or the other complaints mechanisms. It's very time consuming. And then they go back and they alter their online story and nobody
notices.
Nobody notices. We've also...
This is the Jenin refugee camp,
That's
right?
the more recent ones.
Yeah, where there were, I mean, this is home to about 18,000 people, but it's a hotbed of terrorism from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, right? And that's why Israel was doing a targeted offensive.
They did it quite successfully, and we have the comparative photographs of the people the terrorists that were removed or that were killed, the weapons that were found, a tunnel under a mosque where they had explosives was uncovered, and I think a total of about 20 people were killed, nearly all of whom were members of proscribed terrorist organisations. Yeah. The other thing the ABC has done...
horrible reality.
Sometimes there's a breakout of conflict between Israel and Gaza. And I've seen ABC TV coverage where they will show the effect that the IDF, the Israeli Defence Force, has had on bombing the rocket launch sites in Gaza. And sometimes these rocket launch sites are in residential areas or next to schools on purpose. But what they leave out of their coverage is that this was in response to 100 rockets fired into Israel, and they never show the effect of the, fortunately the Iron Dome takes out 90% of them, but occasionally some get through and cause destruction in Israel as well.
Well, look, I think, that the ABC's bias is well known, and it's known as primarily the bias of omission. It's what they don't tell us, it's what they leave out, it's the way that a story is biased. Nothing that they're saying is wrong, nothing that they're saying and showing is incorrect or inaccurate. It's the fact that they're not presenting a full, balanced picture of things through omission that's the problem.
And to the point where it's a severe distortion. So I remember seeing the ABC News one day where it reports that the IDF has launched an operation against Gaza. And if you didn't know any other information, you would assume that for no reason at all, Israel has launched an attack.
Yes.
They left out that it was in response to a barrage of rockets from the terrorists being fired at Israeli civilians.
ABC bias annoys me when it just has political effect here. I can't imagine how it is for you listening to it, thinking that this has an effect on people's lives and, the entire welfare of the state, etc. But look, David, we are out of time. It has been just a fascinating conversation, one that I think needs to be had. And I realise that not everybody out there is going to agree with everything that's been said.
Sure.
Send those emails to the Australian Jewish Association.
No.
But it's been lovely talking to you, David. It's always
send them to the ABC.
Send them to the ABC. Exactly. Thanks so much. I hope you'll come back again sometime and join us.
Thank you, Damian. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great to speak to you. David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association. And that is the end of this episode of The Other Side Interviews. Don't forget, we're up every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. We first stream on ADH TV. And our main show, The Other Side Australia, our weekly news and commentary summary show, is available every Friday night at 8 p.m. on ADH TV. And of course, thereafter, as is this show, on demand for you to watch anytime you like. Our back catalogue of shows is there, so please do dig in. And please tell your friends about this show, The Other Side Australia, The Other Side Interviews, and ADH TV more generally, that we have Alan Jones, we have Mark Stein, we have Daisy Cousins, we have Alexandra Marshall, we've got Fred Paul, so many great people on the platform, and you can choose and select whatever you want to watch whenever you want to watch it. Download the ADH app on your device or on your smart TV. A lot of smart TVs have it. and then you have a nice Netflix Stan binge style interface that you can interact with and easily jump through all of our shows and have a look at all of our shows. We'll catch you on Friday night for The Other Side Australia, but for now, good night, have a great week.